Hey buds, how's it going? I am MC, and today I'm going to be redrawing part of an illustration that I did recently, but this time I'm going to be redrawing it with the red kohl erase pencil. So this is a series of 3 illustrations that I did of an apple, a fig, and a pomegranate that were inspired by the shape and composition of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I've drawn each of them cut in half and illuminated with rays of light that I drew with a metallic gold paint pen, and then each fruit is encircled with a crown of thorns, which is the part that I'm going to be redoing for this video. When I was starting to work on these drawings, I was originally considering to just draw the crown of thorns in red to start, but I was a bit worried that with all the gold around it, it might be a bit hard to look at, so I decided to play it safe and just do the original drawings in graphite to start. But of course, when I looked back on it after I finished, I thought the drawings were kind of boring and needed that pop of color, so I kind of knew right away that I'd be going back and redoing these drawings. This is also just an art process that I really enjoy doing, so even though it's a little bit of extra work, I really don't mind going back and getting the option of having the black and white version of this illustration as well as a colored version of it. So I start copying my drawing by tracing it with a fine tip black Sharpie. I like using Sharpies for this part just because I find you can use a really light touch and they still give you a really bold, solid line, so I don't feel like I'm digging into my drawing while I'm tracing it. Then I use some sandpaper to shave a good amount of charcoal off of one of these compressed sticks directly onto the piece of paper. And then I like to use a brush to spread the charcoal over the page. I find that this helps the charcoal sit on top of the paper rather than get embedded into it, and then it just makes it a bit easier to get the charcoal to move from one piece of paper to the next. The paper I'm using for this is just some Canson sketch paper. I find that this paper has a good amount of tooth to it so that the charcoal isn't just falling off of it and smudging onto anything that it touches. And it's got a good weight to it, so it's not so thin that you're tearing through it when you trace over it a couple times, and it's not too thick that you're constantly fighting to get the right amount of pressure to be able to transfer the charcoal off of it. I'm just doing a couple of passes over my original illustration with a 0.7mm pencil to move the charcoal onto the paper below. And while I'm editing this, I'm actually realizing that using a red Sharpie might be better for this process. Then when I traced over the Sharpie, it would be black on red instead of black on black. Whenever it's black on black, I can never really tell where I've actually traced, so I lose some of the drawing. So I might test that theory and get a red Sharpie for the next time I do this. Using charcoal to copy the initial drawings I did of the crown of thorns is actually a version of very old techniques. This was something I learned how to do in figure drawing classes, but I've also heard about it used as part of the process of painting a fresco. Very quickly, if you don't know, a fresco is a type of mural painting where a layer of wet plaster is laid down, allowed to harden so that a thin film or membrane forms on the top of it, and then paint is applied to the plaster so that when it hardens, the paint essentially becomes part of the wall. It's a very specific and difficult process. There are a lot of chemical reactions and sciencey things that have to happen for it to go right, but it's all really interesting, and if you want to learn more about it, I'd really recommend Ross King's book, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling. It's a really great narrative about Michelangelo painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and basically explains the process step by step, including how the image for the fresco would be transferred onto the ceiling so it could be painted. Basically, an artist like Michelangelo would do a detailed sketch to the same scale as the fresco on a large piece of paper, which was called a cartoon. They would perforate the outlines of the drawing with a sharp stylus, place the cartoon on top of the plaster, and then would bounce a small muslin bag filled with charcoal or synopia, which is basically the same thing, just a reddish brown color instead of black or gray, along the perforated lines of the drawings so they could know where exactly they were going to paint the fresco. It's obviously a bit of a messier and longer process than it would be to just get a light box or hold your drawing up to a window, but it's a good trick to know, especially when you're using thicker stock paper that doesn't let a lot of light through. And I think it's just really cool that such an old technique is still relevant to the drawing process today. Obviously, these illustrations were partly inspired by the Renaissance and Christian art. I love all the stories and symbolism of everything in religious art, and the things that symbolize sin and holiness are ones that I like to incorporate into my own illustrations and artwork quite a bit. And for this series, I decided to just focus in on one of the most classic symbols of sin, which is the forbidden fruit. The three representations of the forbidden fruit that I'm most familiar with are the apple, the fig, and the pomegranate. In Western culture, the apple is obviously the most common depiction of the forbidden fruit that we see, but in classical Italian tradition, the fruit would much more commonly be illustrated as a fig, and in ancient Iranian Christianity, it was believed that a pomegranate would have actually been the fruit that was in the Garden of Eden. There's probably some more meaning that can be pulled from these illustrations, but I'll leave it up to you to decide if there is. I do just find that each of these fruits is very aesthetically pleasing and fun to draw, and I was mainly thinking about the shape of all of these fruits, and when they're cut in half, how they do actually mimic the same shape as a Sacred Heart. The curve of the fruits themselves, but then also the way that the stem comes up out of each of them, especially with the pomegranate, it looks a lot like the flames that come out of the top of the Sacred Heart. When I finish the drawing, I just take a picture of it and put it into Photoshop. And then I do all the basic color corrections that I usually do so that the new part of the illustration will match the original. And I use the lasso tool to cut out the crown of thorns. When I place the new drawing over top of the old, I just use the distort and warp tools to get it placed as accurately as possible. And because I didn't focus too much on making these drawings perfect copies of each other, I go in at the end with the clone tool to remove any of the old crown of thorns that's peeking through the new red one. But yeah, that is how I transfer and copy a drawing using tracing paper and charcoal. It's a pretty basic technique, but it's one that I use all the time as part of my drawing process. And this idea was just kind of one that I came up with for fun, but I ended up being really proud of the drawings, so I wanted to come back to them and do a little bit of extra work on them. And if they're not already, I will be putting them up on my Redbubble account as t-shirt and sticker designs and stuff, so go check that out, I guess. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and the drawing. Take care, and you'll see me in the next one.